And I studied philosophy before I ever started writing, and it remains a big influence on what I do. And in terms of the wisdom of the ordinary, the wisdom is certainly not mine, but there's a significance that inheres in things that I feel, if one pays attention, it's just there. It's just there in the things themselves. It's there in their relationships, and sometimes the very fact of two seemingly mundane things in proximity, they can generate a significance in that proximity that is just, feels to me, just there, waiting to be attended to. Okay. The first poem I'm going to read is called Sturgeon, and it's set not far from where I grew up in southwest Saskatchewan. It's not far from my parents' farm in the river valley of the South Saskatchewan River. And it's the first poem that I feel like I managed to write successfully. Sturgeon. Jackfish and walleye circle like clouds as he strains the silt floor of his pool, a lost lure in his lip. 5 of diamonds, river runt, lazy ike, or a simple spoon feeding a slow disease of rust through his body's quiet armor. Kin to caviar, he's an oily mudfish. Inedible, indelible, ancient grunt of sea in a warm prairie river, prehistory, a third eye in his head. He rests, and time passes as water and sand through the long throat of him, in a hiss as thoughts of food. We take our guilts to his valley and dump them in. Give him quicksilver to corrode his fins, weed killer, gas oil mix, wrap him in poison arms, our bottom feeder, sin eater. On an afternoon mean as a hook, we hauled him up to his nightmare of us and laughed at his ugliness. Soft sucker mouth opening, closing on air that must have felt like ground glass, left him to die with disdain for what we could not consume. And when he began to heave and thrash over yards of rock to the water's edge and, unbelievably, in, we couldn't hold him, though we were teenaged and bigger than everything. Could not contain the old current he had for a mind, its pull, and his body, a muscle called river, called spawn. I'm going to read one now that came out of doing a lot of driving. I wrote this book largely when I was doing grad work at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island, and I would drive an old farm truck home to the farm in Saskatchewan about 4 times a year. And so the first book, Short Haul Engine, has a lot to do with being on the road. It's called Early in Winter. The roads are bad, and you miss your old car, an even-tempered '68 Volvo. Those times jerry-rigged cardboard gaskets and pantyhose fan belts got you home through worse weather. The expansiveness of that gesture. The year's first snow fell at noon and stuck, a thin light resting on the firs that drags out the fade of 4 o'clock and throws a clean sheet over roadkill. A small blessing of dying in winter. There is a loveliness to inadequacy so simply put. I place a hand on your arm. Heavy close a door to the warm kitchen of your body. You are deep inside the driving, leaving me to consider the beautiful stall of water frozen in the act of falling from its pious glacier. To my resolve to find an opening in this season. Feet cold, heart wagging its little tail. I'm going to read a poem now called Thrasher, and the thrasher in question is a brown thrasher, a bird that showed up for a few years on the farm, not really in its territory, but there he was for a few years in a row, and I became quite fond of him. They are mimics, like mockingbirds and certain corvids, so this poem is called Thrasher. Yellow legs ekes lower at nightfall to a stick nest brambled in the shade kill, doing for himself, deft, as a badger in a hammock. Mornings, towing racked heights of the cottonwood, he flaps his brown flag above alkaline slough beds, over ploughlands attesting to the back and forth of work, their brown degrees scriven by road allowance cut at right angles through shriven weeds, fence posts bracketing brown rut lines slantwise in relief. In relief, at the topmost, he mimics domestic, migrant, spaniel, spring peepers, quacks, irks, and gurgles akin to a four-stroke in heavy water. He's slightly off. None respond. His own call is the vinyl scratch between tracks, a splice point. He was hatched that way, ferruginous, a wet transistor clacking from the egg in which he had lain, curled as an ear with an itch inside. He carries on like AM radio, like a prison rodeo. Recounts loser baseball teams, jerry-riggers, part-timers, those paid in scrip, anyone who has come out of retirement once too often. He is playbacks, do-overs, repeats the world's clamorous list, makes it his, replete, and fledges from persistence what he is. My parents and my brother and sister-in-law still farm on the homestead in southwest Saskatchewan, and they farm quite a bit of land, which you have to do when in a place where it doesn't rain. So a lot of land means a lot of big machinery, and a lot of big machinery means a lot of fuel. And a few years ago, they bought a new tractor, and it's an enormous machine. And I have sort of a love-hate relationship with it, because it does represent a lot of what's not good about farming now. But it's also a lot of fun to drive. And there's a reference in this poem to fracking, which has been going on in southwest Saskatchewan for many years and is causing all kinds of damage. But the surface lease money that the companies pay the farmers for access to the land has allowed a number of farmers to stay on their land. So it's a complicated thing. This poem is called Tractor. More than a story high and twice that long, it looks igneous, the Buehler Versatile 2360. Possessed of the ecology of some hellacious minor island on which options are now standard. Cresting the sections in a corona part dirt, part heat, it appears risen full-blown from our deeper needs, aspirating its turbo-cooled air, articulated and fully compatible. What used to take a week, it does in a day on approximately a half mile to the gallon. It cost $150 grand. We hope to own it outright by 2017. Few things wrought by human hands are more sublime than the Buehler Versatile 2360. Across the road, a crew erects the floodlit derricks of a Texan outfit whose presumptions are consistently vindicated. The ancient seabed will be fractured to 1,000 feet by pressuring through a pipe literal tons of a fluid, the constituents of which are best left out of this. To tap the sweet gas where it lies like the side our bread is buttered on. The earth shakes terribly then, dear Houston, dear parent corporation. With its rebroken dead and freshly killed, the air concussive, cardiac, irregular. It silences the arguments of every living thing, and our minds in that time are not entirely elsewhere. But I was speaking of the Buehler Versatile 2360, Phase D, and how well recognized it is among the classics. Wagner, Steiger, International Harvester, John Deere, Case, Minneapolis Moline, Oliver, White, Alice Chalmers, Massey Ferguson, Ford, Wright, Rome. One could say it manifests fate, forged like a pearl around the grit of centuries. That, in a sense, it's always been with us, the diesel smell of a foregone conclusion. In times of doubt, we cast our eyes upon the Bueller Versatile 2360 and are comforted. And when it breaks down, or thinks itself in gear and won't, for our own good, start, it takes a guy out from the city at $60 an hour, plus travel and parts, to fix it. This is a poem from the section of new poems in the collection, and it's called "The Road In Is Not the Same Road Out," and was written after I discovered that it's possible to feel lost even knowing that you are not lost. The road in is not the same road out. The perspective is unfamiliar. We hadn't looked back driving in and lingered too long at the viewpoint. It was a prime of life experience. Many things we know by their effects. Void in the rock that the river may advance. Void in the river that the fish may advance. Helicopter in the canyon like a fly in a jar, a mote in the eye, a wandering cause. It grew dark, a shift change and a shift in protocol. To the surface of the road, a trail rose, then a path to the surface of the trail. The desert sent its loose rock up to sea. An inaudible, catastrophic orchestra is tuning. We feel it in the air, impelled before it as a pressure on the brain. In the day, separate rays fall so thickly from their source, we cannot perceive the gaps between them, but night is absolute, uniform, and self-derived, the formerly irrelevant brought to bear, the progress of its native creatures unimpeded. We have a plan between us, and then we each have our own. Land of the four corners, the silent partner, $500 down, no questions. The rental car stops at the highway intersection, a filthy, violent storm under the hood. It yields to traffic from both directions. It appears it could go either way. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote for my friend Jimmy Coates, who died a few years ago while I was on the Isle of Skye. And he didn't have an easy life. And this poem is called Spiral. Spiral. You said a storm makes a mansion of a poor man's house. I wonder if you did so to make the best of living where it always blew. The maddening wind that messed up our ions and made men want to fight. Now you have no house. There's no need. The cure took the good with the bad. Who cannot escape his prison but must each day rebuild it? For a year, rather than drink, we smoked and went to bingo. It was like working in a mine, the air quality and incessant coughing, bag lunches, good luck charms, the intergenerational drama. It's not my place to say what changed. You hadn't developed around a midpoint and fell to the side. A part remained exposed. Still, you were kind, unusually so, it seems to me now, for someone with talent. But loneliness expands to fill the void it creates. To plot against it was to plot against yourself. You felt the effect of the whole. When the mind is so altered, this resembles death, but it is not death. Then the faint trail ran out, and you continued on. The night you've entered now has no lost wife in it, no daughter, no friends, betrayal, or fear. It is impartial, without status. I would like to think it peace, but suspect it isn't anything. When our friend wrote that you died, I was on Skye, where the wind in its many directions is directionless and impossible to put your back to. He said you'd been living rough for a while. He wouldn't go to the wake at the bar. It was too much sadness. That day, I'd walked the beach, picking up shells, their spirals of Archimedes and logarithmic spirals, principle of proportional similarity that protects the creature and makes it beautiful. Sandpipers materialized through tears the wind made, chasing fringes of the rising tide. At first, there were 2, then 3 appeared, but when I began to pay attention, I realized they were everywhere. Yeah, I kind of like shooting cans off fences, but
You can shoot?
yeah, just a 22. Growing up on the farm, it's like a tool. It's not a weapon. It's a tool. Yeah.
So you can like...
Yeah, it's quite fun, and it's 22 is just a kind of a big BB gun, really. Well, yeah, lots of hunting where I grew up.